Welcome to Cafe Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin today at the brownstone on West 35th Street with The Second Slice Was Poisoned. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's ease into it. The Second Slice Was Poisoned. Chapter 1. A Disturbed Schedule. It was the second Tuesday in April, and in the old brownstone on West 35th Street, 3 blocks from the Hudson, Nero Wolfe was being unreasonable about corn. Not that this was anything new. Standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, I watched as he lectured Fritz Brenner on the proper way to prepare corn on the cob for that evening's dinner. As if Fritz hadn't been cooking corn to perfection for more than 20 years. The error, Wolfe declared, is in the timing. 4 minutes, not a second more. And the water must be at a full rolling boil before the corn is introduced. Otherwise, the conversion of sugar to starch proceeds unchecked. Fritz, his lean face a study in professional forbearance, nodded. Yes, sir. 4 minutes precisely. I cleared my throat. Your orchids are waiting, sir. It's 9:13. Wolfe's schedule was as immutable as the tides. 9 to 11 in the morning with Theodore and the orchids. 11 to lunch working in the office. After lunch, more office time until the afternoon orchid session. Any deviation might cause Western civilization to collapse, or so he seemed to believe. He turned his imposing bulk, 1/7 of a ton, as he occasionally admitted, and regarded me with narrowed eyes. I am aware of the time, Archie. Just keeping the wheels of industry turning, I said cheerfully. He grunted, gave Fritz one final meaningful look, and followed me down the hall past the office to the elevator. I pressed the button, the door opened, and he entered. I didn't join him. The orchids were his private communion, and Theodore Horseman, the orchid nurse, would provide any needed assistance. I returned to the office, sat at my desk, and checked the morning mail. Bills, a few inquiries about potential cases that wouldn't meet Wolfe's exacting standards or generous fee requirements, and a letter from a satisfied client whose wayward daughter we had located the previous month. Nothing that would disturb Wolfe's precious routine, which is why when the phone rang at 10:17 a.m., I wasn't expecting trouble. Nero Wolfe's office, Archie Goodwin speaking. This is Marcel Boucher. The voice had the kind of polished French accent that costs thousands to acquire at Swiss finishing schools, or comes free if you actually grew up in France. I must speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. It is a matter of the utmost urgency. I'm afraid Mr. Wolfe is indisposed until 11. I'd be happy to take a message, or you can call back then. A pause, then. Tell him it's Marcel Boucher of Couteau d'Or. A man has died at my restaurant under impossible circumstances. The police are here, and I require Mr. Wolfe's assistance immediately. Couteau d'Or was only the most exclusive French restaurant in Manhattan, with a 3-month waiting list and prices that made millionaires think twice. I'd never eaten there, but I'd read enough about it to know that Marcel Boucher was considered a culinary genius. I'll convey your message, Mr. Boucher, but I should warn you that Mr. Wolfe rarely leaves his house. I am prepared to pay $50,000 for his immediate attention to this matter. His voice was tight, strained. 100,000 if he resolves it discreetly. That got my attention. It would get Wolfe's too, though he would pretend otherwise. I'll inform him right away, Mr. Boucher. Please hold the line. I put the call on hold and took the stairs 2 at a time up to the plant rooms. I knew better than to use the house phone to interrupt Wolfe during his orchid time, and this was worth the climb. The plant rooms on the roof were Wolfe's paradise, warm, humid, and filled with 10,000 orchid plants of incalculable value. I found him in the tropical room, using a small camel hair brush to hand-pollinate a Cattleya hybrid, Theodore hovering nearby like a surgical nurse. "Excuse me, sir," I said, standing at the threshold. "One does not walk uninvited among Wolfe's orchids." He didn't look up. "It is 10:19, Archie. You know my schedule." Marcel Boucher of Couteau d'Or is on the phone. Someone has died at his restaurant under what he calls impossible circumstances. He's offering $50,000 for your immediate attention, $100,000 for a discreet resolution. Wolfe's hand stopped, the brush poised in mid-air. After a moment, he carefully completed the pollination, placed the brush on Theodore's waiting tray, and straightened to his full height. "Is the police involvement confirmed? He says they're there now." Wolfe sighed, a sound like air escaping from a bellows. "Tell Mr. Boucher I will speak with him. Bring the phone in." 15 minutes later, I was driving the sedan toward Midtown. Wolfe was not with me, of course not. He would not leave the brownstone for a death at a 3-star restaurant, not even for $100,000, but I was authorized to collect information, take statements, and report back to him. If the case proved sufficiently interesting or lucrative, he might consent to receive visitors at the brownstone later. Marcel Boucher had been frantic on the phone, his elegant accent fracturing under stress. Julian Lambert, New York's most influential food critic, had collapsed and died during a private tasting menu at Couteau d'Or. One moment he had been savoring the duck pâté, the next he was gasping and choking. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. The curious part, the detail that had persuaded Wolfe to dispatch me immediately, was that everyone at the table had eaten the same dish, prepared identically. Only Lambert had died. As I navigated through the late morning traffic, I wondered what we were getting into. Food critics made enemies, certainly, but murder at a private tasting seemed excessive, even by New York standards. I parked half a block from the restaurant's discreet entrance, where a small crowd of reporters had already gathered behind a police barricade. A uniformed officer checked my ID against Marcel's authorized list and waved me through. Inside, the restaurant was all subdued lighting, cream-colored walls, and dark wood, the kind of place where the menus don't list prices because, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. The maître d', a thin man with perfect posture, led me to a private dining room at the rear, his face as expressionless as if he were guiding me to a regular reservation rather than a murder scene. I steeled myself for what I might find. 20 years as Nero Wolfe's right hand had shown me plenty of death, but it never gets routine. What I wasn't prepared for was the tableau that awaited me. 6 living people seated at a round table, glasses of water before them, shell-shocked expressions on their faces, and one empty chair with a napkin crumpled on the floor beside it. The duck pâté, I noted, was still on the table. Chapter 2. 7 at the Table. Inspector Kramer hadn't arrived yet, which was a small mercy. I had maybe 15 minutes to get the lay of the land before he showed up and started asking why Nero Wolfe was poking his nose into police business. The private dining room at Couteau d'Or was elegant but not ostentatious, cream walls, dark wainscoting, and a round table that could seat 8 comfortably. The lighting was soft, from wall sconces rather than overhead fixtures. A serving cart stood against one wall, and a door in the corner presumably led to the kitchen. I approached the table where the 6 survivors sat in various states of shock. Marcel Boucher detached himself from a conversation with a uniformed officer and hurried over to me, hand extended. "Mr. Goodwin, thank you for coming so quickly." His handshake was firm, but his fingers were cold. He was a compact man, maybe 50, with the intense eyes of someone who had spent decades focusing on tiny details. "Tell me what happened, Mr. Boucher, from the beginning." "It was a private tasting, 7 guests, including Julian. A preview of our spring menu." He gestured toward the table. They had completed 5 courses. The duck pâté en croûte was the 6th. Julian took 1 bite, said it was exquisite. Then he took a 2nd bite and... Boucher made a choking sound and drew his hand across his throat. I glanced at the table. Each place setting had a small portion of what I assumed was the duck pâté, with 1 or 2 bites missing. At the empty place, the pâté was barely touched. Everyone else ate the same dish, precisely the same, from the same preparation. And no one else felt ill? No one. It is impossible, Mr. Goodwin. I have been a chef for 30 years. This cannot happen. But it had happened, which made it not only possible, but actual. "I need to speak with everyone," I said. "Starting with you. Where were you when Mr. Lambert collapsed?" "In the kitchen, preparing the 7th course, a quail consommé with black truffle." "And who served the pâté?" "Anton, my sous chef." He pointed to a lean young man with hollow cheeks who was speaking with 2 plain-clothes officers. "He served each plate personally." "I'll need to talk to him too. For now, introduce me to the guests." Boucher led me to the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Archie Goodwin, associate of the private detective Nero Wolfe. Please answer his questions fully." I nodded to the group, noting their positions around the table. Clockwise from the empty chair, a silver-haired man with a permanent frown, a woman in her 30s with sharp features and sharper eyes, a heavy-set man whose expensive suit strained at the buttons, a younger man with a notebook, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture and a pearl necklace, and a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses. 7 at the table, now 6. "I'm sorry to intrude on a difficult moment," I began, "but I'd appreciate your names and your connection to Mr. Lambert." The silver-haired man spoke first. "Gregory Voss, restaurant critic for the Tribune. Julian was a colleague and a friend for 20 years. His tone suggested that friend might be stretching it. The sharp-featured woman was next. "Eliza Winters, I'm Julian's assistant, She blinked rapidly. "Donald Pratt," said the heavy-set man. "I own the Gaslight Group, 3 restaurants downtown. Julian was reviewing one of them next week." He tugged at his collar as if it had suddenly tightened. The young man with the notebook didn't look up. "Peter Morgan. I was Julian's apprentice. He was mentoring me." "Vivian Dexter," said the woman with pearls. "I publish Food and Wine monthly. Julian wrote our feature column." The man with wire-rimmed glasses cleared his throat. "Bernard Shaw. I'm Julian's attorney." His voice was surprisingly deep for his slight frame. I took mental notes of their appearances, positions, and the subtle tensions between them. Wolfe would want every detail. "What can you tell me about Mr. Lambert's dining habits? Anything unusual?" Eliza Winters raised a perfectly manicured hand. "Julian was methodical. He always took exactly 2 bites of each dish, the first to appreciate the initial flavor profile, the second to analyze the complexity. And he insisted on fresh silverware for each bite," added Voss with a hint of contempt. "A clean fork for the second taste. He claimed it was to avoid flavor contamination." I glanced at the place settings. Each had multiple forks of different sizes. "Were these the utensils he used today?" "No," said Eliza. "Julian always brought his own set, sterling silver, custom-made. He was particular about metal affecting taste. I made a note of that." "And where is this silverware now?" "The police took it," Bernard Shaw said, "along with everything else on his place setting." "Did anyone notice anything unusual about Mr. Lambert before he collapsed? Any complaints about the food? Any symptoms?" They exchanged glances, then Peter Morgan spoke up. He said the pâté was a triumph. Those were his exact words. He wrote it down. He tapped his own notebook. Then he asked for a fresh fork for his second bite. That's when it happened. Donald Pratt shifted his bulk in the delicate chair. It was horrible. His face turned red, then purple. He knocked over his water glass trying to stand, then he just collapsed. How long before medical help arrived? 8 minutes, said Vivian Dexter precisely. I timed it. Far too long, though I doubt it would have mattered. I was about to ask another question when Anton, the sous chef, approached with a uniformed officer. Sir, he said to Boucher, they want me to come to the station for more questions. Boucher looked alarmed. This is outrageous. Anton has worked for me for 5 years. He is beyond reproach. The officer, unimpressed, gestured toward the door. Just routine, sir. We need detailed statements from everyone who handled the food. As Anton was led away, I noticed Peter Morgan watching intently, scribbling something in his notebook. When he saw me observing him, he quickly closed it. Mr. Goodwin, Eliza Winters said suddenly, as something you should know, Julian was working on an important article, an exposé. He was very secretive about it, but it had him worried. He'd been receiving strange calls. What kind of exposé? He wouldn't say exactly. Something about restaurant financing. He said it would change the culinary landscape of New York. Before I could follow up, there was a commotion at the door. Inspector Kramer had arrived, chomping on an unlit cigar and looking like a storm cloud in a rumpled suit. His eyes found me immediately and his face darkened further. Goodwin, he growled. I might have known. Where's Wolfe? At home with his orchids. Where else? I'm just gathering information, Inspector. Kramer grunted something unflattering about orchids and private detectives. Well, I gather it's somewhere else. This is a police investigation. I knew better than to argue. I had enough to make a preliminary report to Wolfe, and we could decide our next steps. I handed my card to each person at the table and made my exit, noting that Bernard Shaw had moved to sit beside Eliza Winters and was speaking to her in a low, urgent tone. Outside, the April sun seemed unnaturally bright after the restaurant's dim interior. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, organizing my thoughts. One man dead from a dish that 6 others had eaten without ill effect. A critic with enemies and a secret exposé. Custom silverware that only the victim had used. Wolfe would see connections that I couldn't. But first I had to get through the midday traffic and back to the brownstone before lunch. Otherwise I'd face something worse than murder, Wolfe's displeasure at a delayed meal. Chapter 3. Appetites and Ambitions. I was back at the brownstone by 12:40, which meant Wolfe was already at the dining table. You could set your watch by his schedule. Breakfast at 8 in his room, lunch at 1 o'clock sharp, dinner at 8 o'clock sharp. The routine was sacred. Fritz was just setting a plate of sliced tomatoes with basil and olive oil in front of Wolfe when I entered the dining room. Satisfactory, Wolfe said, inspecting the arrangement. He lifted his eyes to me. You're late. Midtown traffic, I replied, sliding into my chair. And Inspector Kramer was arriving as I left. Pfui. Wolfe selected a tomato slice with his fork. I presume you gathered the essential facts. I waited until Fritz had served me and retreated to the kitchen before reporting. I kept it concise and chronological, just as Wolfe preferred. The private tasting, the 7 diners, the sudden death after the second bite of duck pâté, the custom silverware, the mystery exposé, the reactions of the survivors. Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes half closed as he methodically worked through his tomatoes. Most interesting, he said when I finished. The silverware, especially, and this exposé on restaurant financing. Fritz arrived with the main course, chicken fricassee with mushrooms and new potatoes, and we paused our conversation. Wolfe considered it sacrilege to discuss business while appreciating Fritz's cooking. After lunch, we moved to the office. Wolfe settled his 1/7 of a ton in his custom chair behind his desk. I took my chair at my desk and opened my notebook. "We'll need additional information," Wolfe declared. "The restaurant's history and its competitors, Mr. Lambert's professional connections and personal enemies, and most crucially, what he had discovered about restaurant financing that warranted an exposé." "I can start with the restaurant angle," I suggested. Couteau d'Or has been open for 3 years. Before that, the space housed Bellini's, an Italian place that closed suddenly amid rumors of health code violations. Were these violations substantiated? Not according to the public record, but the closure was abrupt. Bellini's had been there for 15 years. Wolfe frowned slightly. "Contact Saul Panzer. I want him to inquire about the custom silverware, where it was made, who handled it, when it was last in Mr. Lambert's possession." Saul was the best operative in New York, and he didn't come cheap. That Wolfe wanted him immediately meant he saw something promising in this case. "And I'll need Mr. Lambert's notebook," Wolfe continued. "From your description, his apprentice, Peter Morgan, maintains similar notes. Arrange to see them." "The police have Lambert's effects," I reminded him. "Yes, most inconvenient." Wolfe's tone suggested that the NYPD existed primarily to obstruct his investigations. "You'll have to persuade Inspector Kramer of our legitimate interest in the case." That would be about as easy as persuading a cat to take a bath, but I nodded anyway. "Call Mr. Boucher, inform him that I am considering his case and request samples of all food served at the event prepared identically." This was interesting. Wolfe rarely concerned himself with physical evidence, preferring to solve puzzles through psychology and reason. I spent the afternoon making calls and compiling information. Julian Lambert had been reviewing restaurants for 20 years, first for small publications, then for increasingly prestigious ones. His reputation was built on brutal honesty and an uncompromising palate. His column could make or break a new restaurant. He had a knack for finding hidden gems in unlikely places, Eliza Winters told me over the phone. But he could be merciless about pretension or mediocrity. "Were there any recent reviews that caused particular backlash?" I asked. "He eviscerated Vincenzo's 3 months ago," she said, "called it an overpriced monument to culinary incompetence. The owner confronted him at a charity event last month." I made a note to look into Vincenzo's. "What about this exposé he was working on?" A pause. "I don't know the details. He kept his notes locked away and the files on his computer, a password protected. But I know he had meetings with several industry insiders over the past few weeks, and he was photographing documents." "Any idea what kinds of documents?" "Financial records, I think. Bank statements, invoices. He mentioned something about following the money last week." After hanging up, I called the office of Bernard Shaw, Lambert's attorney. His secretary informed me that Mr. Shaw was unavailable for the remainder of the day. Convenient. At 4 o'clock, Wolfe descended from the plant rooms after his afternoon session with the orchids. He settled at his desk, rang for beer, and looked at me expectantly. "I've got a list of Lambert's enemies, which is essentially every chef he's ever criticized," I reported. "But a few stand out. Vincent Russo of Vincenzo's had a public confrontation with him recently, and there's a chef named Thomas Grant who lost his restaurant after Lambert's review called his food criminally negligent." Wolfe grunted. "Predictable grievances. What of the exposé?" "Still unclear. His assistant confirms he was collecting financial documents related to restaurants. His computer and notebooks are locked or in police custody." "And Mr. Boucher?" "He's sending over food samples with his sous chef. Not Anton, who's still being questioned, but someone named Elliot," should arrive around 6. Fritz entered with a tray bearing a bottle of beer and a glass. Wolfe poured with his usual precision, drank a third of it, and wiped his lips with a handkerchief. "I have dispatched Saul to investigate the silverware," he said. "He will report this evening. Meanwhile, I want you to visit Mr. Lambert's residence. Miss Winters may be persuaded to grant you access. And if she isn't, then persuade her." Wolfe's expression was bland. "I understand you have a certain aptitude for gaining the cooperation of female witnesses." I ignored the jab. "What am I looking for specifically?" "His notebook, as I mentioned, and any indication of what financial irregularities he had uncovered. Concentrate on recent correspondence and research materials." I nodded and reached for my hat. Before I could leave, the phone rang. It was Donald Pratt, the heavy-set restaurant owner from the tasting. "Mr. Goodwin, I've been thinking about what happened. There's something you should know about Julian Lambert. He wasn't just a critic. He was an investor, silent partner in several restaurants across the city." "Including any that he reviewed?" "That's just it," Pratt said, his voice lowered. "I believe so, which would be a massive conflict of interest." "Do you have proof?" "Not yet. But that's what his exposé was about. Not restaurant financing in general, specifically about critics who secretly profit from the places they review. And Lambert was preparing to name names. If true, this would give several people a motive for wanting Lambert silenced." I thanked Pratt and hung up, then reported the conversation to Wolfe. He leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together in front of his substantial middle. "Most illuminating," he said. "Our case acquires additional dimensions." "You think Pratt is telling the truth?" "That remains to be seen, but consider. If Mr. Lambert was indeed preparing to expose corruption within his own profession, the list of potential enemies expands considerably." I reached again for my hat. The spring evening was cool but pleasant as I headed for my car, mentally reviewing what we knew. A poison that affected only one person, custom silverware. A secret exposé that might implicate not just chefs but critics as well. I had a feeling this case was going to get messier before Wolfe untangled it. Chapter 4. Silver and Secrets. Eliza Winters lived in a pre-war building on East 72nd Street. The doorman announced me, and she buzzed me up immediately. Her apartment was tastefully furnished with the kind of minimalist decor that takes serious money to achieve. Nothing out of place, nothing unnecessary. "I've been expecting you," she said, showing me to a sleek leather sofa. "Though I wasn't sure if you'd come today or tomorrow." "I like to exceed expectations," I told her. "I need to see Julian Lambert's notes and files related to the exposé he was working on." She perched on an armchair across from me. "The police have already been through his office. They took his computer and several files. But not everything, I'm guessing." A slight smile. Julian was cautious. He kept backups and alternates, and he didn't trust technology for his most sensitive work. She crossed to a bookshelf and removed what looked like a leather-bound edition of Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Inside was a hollowed space containing a small notebook with a black cover. "He left this with me last week, said if anything happened to him I should use my judgment about what to do with it." I took the notebook. The first few pages contained what looked like restaurant reviews in progress, written in a cramped, precise hand. But further in, there were columns of numbers, initials, and cryptic notations. One page was headed Money Trail, CO to GV via DP. CO could be Couteau d'Or, I mused. GV would be Gregory Voss, the critic who was at the tasting, and DP is likely Donald Pratt. Julian was connecting some dots between certain critics and restaurant owners, Eliza confirmed, financial relationships that weren't disclosed. I photographed several pages with my pocket camera, knowing Wolfe would want to study them in detail. Did he mention anyone specifically who might be dangerous if exposed? She hesitated. He was concerned about Gregory Voss, said Voss had powerful friends who played rough. His words, I handed back the notebook. Keep this safe. We may need it again. When I returned to the brownstone, Saul Panzer was waiting in the office with Wolfe. Saul was small, wiry, and unimpressive to look at, until you noticed his eyes, which missed nothing. He was the best operative in New York, and Wolfe paid him accordingly. The silverware was custom-made by William Steele and Sons, Saul reported without preamble. Sterling silver with a proprietary alloy that supposedly doesn't affect taste. Lambert ordered the set 5 years ago, 12-place settings at $2,000 each. Wolfe raised his eyebrows a fraction. Extravagant. Gets better, Saul continued. 3 weeks ago, Lambert brought his personal set to Steele for cleaning and polishing, standard service they offer to clients. The set was returned to him 2 days before the tasting. I sat at my desk and made notes. Who handled it at Steele's? That's where it gets interesting, Saul said. The craftsman who normally services Lambert silver was on vacation. A new employee handled it instead, guy named Robert Finch. And this Mr. Finch quit the day after Lambert's set was returned. Left no forwarding address. I'm working on tracking him down. Wolfe sipped his beer thoughtfully. Most suggestive. Continue your inquiries, Saul. Find this Mr. Finch, and determine if anyone connected to our case has any relationship with William Steele and Sons. After Saul left, I showed Wolfe the photographs of Lambert's notebook. He studied them with his lips pursed. The connection between Couteau d'Or, Gregory Voss, and Donald Pratt requires elucidation, he said finally. And we need further information on the financial structure of Couteau d'Or. I can look into that, I offered. Yes. But first, I believe our food samples have arrived. Fritz mentioned a delivery. In the kitchen, Fritz was examining containers of food with professional interest. Elliot, the sous chef from Couteau d'Or, stood nervously by the counter. Mr. Boucher sent everything from the tasting menu, Elliot explained. Prepared exactly as it was served, including the duck pâté. Fritz gave a small nod of approval at the presentation. Even packaged for transport, the food looked immaculate. Wolfe entered and greeted Elliot with formal courtesy. Thank you for bringing these samples. I have some questions about the preparation methods. Of course, sir. The duck pâté, how was it constructed? Elliot's face lit up with professional pride. Duck liver, pork fat, cognac, and our blend of spices. The pastry is made with European butter. Each portion is individually baked in its own mould. And the service? Each portion was plated in the kitchen by Anton, our sous chef. He personally carried them to the dining room on a tray. Could anyone have tampered with Mr. Lambert's portion specifically? Elliot looked uncomfortable. I don't see how. Anton prepared them identically and served them all at once. After Elliot left, Fritz examined the duck pâté with critical attention. Excellent technique, he pronounced. The pastry is perfect. Wolfe nodded. This preparation seems inconsistent with selective poisoning. If the toxin were in the food, all would be affected. Unless it was added to Lambert's plate specifically, I suggested. In front of 6 witnesses? Unlikely. Wolfe frowned. No, Archie, we must look elsewhere for our solution. Later that evening, I was typing up my notes when the phone rang. It was Bernard Shaw, Lambert's attorney. Mr. Goodwin, I understand you've been making inquiries about Julian's work. That's right. I need to inform you that all of Julian's notes and unpublished materials are legally protected. His exposé is the property of his estate, which I represent. We're investigating his death, Mr. Shaw, not trying to scoop his story. Nevertheless, I must insist that you cease any attempts to access his confidential files. Otherwise, I'll be forced to seek an injunction." After hanging up, I relayed the conversation to Wolfe. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Mr. Shaw seems anxious to keep Mr. Lambert's discoveries private. Could Shaw be representing someone implicated in the exposé? It's possible. Attorneys often serve multiple clients." At 9:30, after Wolfe had retired to his quarter on the second floor with a book, the phone rang again. This time, it was Eliza Winters, her voice tense. "Someone broke into my apartment while I was out to dinner. They tore the place apart." "The notebook is safe. I had it with me." "But they were looking for something, Mr. Goodwin." "Where are you now?" "At a hotel. I didn't feel safe at home." "Good. Stay there. Don't tell anyone where you are." I hung up and stared at the phone, considering the implications. Someone was desperate enough to break into Eliza's apartment looking for Lambert's notes. The stakes were escalating. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. Somewhere out there was a killer who had managed to poison one specific person at a table of 7, leaving no trace that the police could detect, and who was now hunting for evidence of the motive. Tomorrow would be a busy day. We needed answers about the silverware, the financial connections, and whatever explosive information Lambert had uncovered, but for tonight, all I could do was make sure my .32 was loaded and within reach. Chapter 5. Taste and Timing. The morning began with a summons to Wolfe's bedroom, which happened about as often as a solar eclipse. I knocked and entered to find him propped up on pillows, yellow pajamas immaculate, reading a book on toxicology. "I've been considering the timing," he said without preamble. "Mr. Lambert consumed 2 bites of pâté, yes? When did symptoms begin, after the first bite or the second?" "The second," I said. According to the witnesses, he praised the dish after the first bite, then requested a fresh fork, took a second bite, and immediately showed distress. "Ah." Wolfe marked his page and closed the book. "Most illuminating." "Is it?" "Indeed. I want you to telephone Fred Durkin, have him visit Mr. Lambert's apartment. Tell him to look specifically for medications, both prescription and over-the-counter. Fred wasn't as sharp as Saul, but he was reliable and followed instructions exactly. I arranged for him to meet Eliza at Lambert's place, then headed down for breakfast. By 11, Wolfe was at his desk, beer at his elbow, reviewing the case. What do we know of Couteau d'Or's financial structure? Marcel Boucher is the executive chef and public face, but he's not the owner, I reported, checking my notes. The restaurant is owned by Golden Knife Ventures, a holding company. The principal investors include Donald Pratt of the Gaslight Group and 2 silent partners. And these silent partners? Still working on identification. Corporate records are deliberately obscured. Wolfe grunted. Corporate veils exist to be pierced. Continue your efforts. At 1 o'clock, we broke for lunch. Fritz had prepared a Spanish tortilla with a side of marinated artichoke hearts, followed by a cheese soufflé that would make angels weep. Wolfe ate with his usual concentration, forbidding business talk until coffee was served. "I've invited Marcel Boucher to visit at 6 this evening," he announced over his coffee cup. "I have questions about the preparation and service of the fatal meal that require precise answers." "You think he's involved?" "Everyone connected to that table is involved, Archie. The question is nature and degree." After lunch, I drove to the offices of Food and Wine Monthly to speak with Vivian Dexter, the editor, who had been at the tasting. Her office was sleek and modern, with framed magazine covers displaying exquisite food photography. "Mr. Goodwin?" she greeted me, not rising from behind her glass desk. How can I help Nero Wolfe's investigation? Ms. Dexter, could you clarify the exact timeline of events at the tasting, particularly around when Mr. Lambert began showing symptoms? She folded her hands precisely. We were served the duck pâté at 1:47 p.m. I noted the time because I had a conference call scheduled for 2:30. Julian took his first bite at approximately 1:49. He commented on the excellence of the dish, then requested a fresh fork, as was his custom. He took his second bite at 1:52. Within seconds he began to cough. By 1:53 he was gasping. At 1:55 he collapsed. The ambulance was called immediately but didn't arrive until 2:03. By then he was already gone. Her clinical precision was unsettling. You seem very certain of these times. I'm an editor, Mr. Goodwin. Precision is my profession. She opened a drawer and removed a small notebook. I document everything. Habit of 30 years in publishing. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Lambert's behavior before the pâté course? He was animated, more talkative than usual. He had been making notes throughout the meal, but he seemed particularly interested in Donald Pratt. Asked him several pointed questions about restaurant investment structures. And Mr. Pratt's reaction? Uncomfortable. He kept changing the subject. Back at the brownstone, I found Fred Durkin waiting in the office. Wolfe was engrossed in a botanical catalogue. I checked Lambert's place like you asked, Fred reported. Found a medicine cabinet full of the usual stuff, aspirin, antacids, sleeping pills, but there was also a prescription for something called methoxyphenamine, for asthma, according to the label. Asthma, I raised an eyebrow. None of the witnesses mentioned Lambert having breathing problems. The prescription was recent, Fred added, filled just 3 weeks ago. Wolfe looked up from his catalogue. Most interesting. Was the medication being taken? Check the pill count. That's just it, Fred said. The bottle was full. 30 pills, none missing. A new prescription unfilled, Wolfe murmured. Continue, Fred. Any other findings? I found a notebook hidden in a hollowed-out book. Cookbook, actually. Fred produced a small leather-bound journal. Similar to the one Eliza Winters showed me, I noted. But not identical, Wolfe pointed out, examining it. The binding is different. I flipped through the notebook. It contained more of Lambert's cramped handwriting, but these notes were more explicit. Names, amounts, dates, financial transactions linking restaurants to critics. And on the final page, a single line, GV equals 15% silent stake in CO via offshore. Proof confirmed. GV is Gregory Voss, I said. He owns a hidden stake in Couteau d'Or while reviewing restaurants for the Tribune. A significant conflict of interest, Wolfe agreed. And possibly a motive for murder, I added, if Lambert was about to expose this in his article. At 5:30, the doorbell rang. I expected Marcel Boucher, but instead found Anton, the sous chef who had served the fatal meal. He was pale and agitated. I must speak with Mr. Wolfe, he insisted. It's about the silverware. I brought him to the office where Wolfe was just settling in after his afternoon session with the orchids. Mr. Anton, Wolfe greeted him. You have information for us? Anton twisted his hands. When I served the pâté, I noticed something odd about Mr. Lambert's fork. The second one, the one he requested fresh. It looked different. Slightly discoloured on the tines. Different how? Wolfe asked. A faint yellowish tint. I thought it was just tarnish. Silver does that sometimes. Did you mention this to the police? Yes, but they didn't seem interested. Said it was normal tarnish. But I've been working with silver service for 12 years. This was different. After Anton left, I looked at Wolfe. Discoloured fork tines. Could be significant. Indeed, especially given the timing of symptoms after the second bite. Wolfe pressed his lips together. We are approaching a theory, Archie, but we require more evidence. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Marcel Boucher. precisely on time for his 6 o'clock appointment. "I came directly from the restaurant," he said, removing his coat. "The police have finally released the private dining room, though we haven't reopened yet. The publicity has been challenging." I showed him to the office where Wolfe was pouring beer. The red leather chair reserved for clients faced Wolfe's desk. I took my place at my own desk, notebook ready. "Mr. Boucher," Wolfe began, "I believe we are making progress in understanding Mr. Lambert's death, but I need to know more about your relationship with Gregory Voss." Boucher's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Gregory is a respected critic. We have a professional relationship, nothing more. Is he an investor in Couteau d'Or?" A pause. "I'm not at liberty to discuss our financial structure. Even when it might relate to murder—" Wolfe's voice was mild, but his eyes had narrowed. Boucher stood abruptly. "I engaged you to find who poisoned Julian Lambert, not to investigate my business affairs." "The two are inseparable," Wolfe replied. "Please sit down, Mr. Boucher. We have much to discuss." Chapter 6. Recipes for Disaster. Marcel Boucher sat down again, his face tight. "I apologize for my outburst. This situation has been difficult." "Understandable," Wolfe replied, not sounding particularly understanding. "Nevertheless, I require complete candor. Is Gregory Voss an investor in your restaurant?" Boucher exhaled slowly. "Not directly, but yes. He has a financial interest through a holding company. Many critics have investments in the industry. It's not uncommon." "But undisclosed," Wolfe noted, "and potentially damaging if revealed." "In some contexts, yes." Boucher studied his hands. Julian knew. He'd been investigating financial connections between critics and the restaurants they review. "And your establishment was among those he planned to expose." A nod. "Along with several others. It would have damaged many reputations, including Gregory's." After Boucher left, promising to provide documentation on the restaurant's financial structure, I looked at Wolfe. So Voss had motive. He stood to lose his reputation and possibly his position at the Tribune if Lambert published his exposé. As did others, no doubt. Wolfe's expression was thoughtful. "But motive without method remains insufficient. We need to understand precisely how the poison was administered to Mr. Lambert alone." The phone rang. It was Fred Durkin reporting, "From the silversmith, William Steele and Sons." "I found something interesting about that employee who quit, Robert Finch," Fred said. "He was using a fake identity. The social security number he provided belongs to a man who died 3 years ago." "Most interesting," said Wolfe when I relayed this information. "And his current whereabouts?" "Fred's still working on it," I replied. "But he did learn that Finch specifically requested to work on Lambert's silverware when it came in for servicing." Wolfe raised his eyebrows a fraction. "The pieces begin to align. We need those draft pages of Mr. Lambert's exposé. The police must have them by now." Getting anything from Inspector Kramer was usually like extracting honey from a particularly irritable hive of bees, but I had my methods. A call to Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, carefully worded to suggest we might have information beneficial to their case, arranged a meeting for the next morning. The following day began with Wolfe altering his sacred morning schedule. Instead of spending the full 2 hours with his orchids, he came down to the office at 10:30, a clear indication of his interest in the case. "I have been considering the chemistry involved," he announced, lowering himself into his chair. "Certain toxins react with silver to create compounds that dissolve slowly when exposed to acid." "Like the acid in food," I suggested. "Precisely. The duck pâté would have mild acidity from the cognac. perhaps insufficient to dissolve the toxin immediately, but enough for a delayed reaction. Which explains why the symptoms appeared after the second bite, I said, following his reasoning. The poison needed time to dissolve into the food. A theory requiring verification. Wolfe reached for the phone. We need an expert on metallurgy and chemical reactions. While Wolfe consulted with a chemistry professor from Columbia University, I left for my meeting with Pearlie Stebbins at a diner near the precinct. "We've got toxicology results," Pearlie admitted after I'd plied him with coffee and donuts. "Lambert died from acute thallium poisoning. Nasty stuff. And, yeah, we found drafts of an article he was writing. Explosive material about critics secretly investing in restaurants they review." "Any names mentioned specifically?" Pearlie eyed me suspiciously. "Several. Gregory Voss was prominently featured, so was a woman named Helen Burke from the Daily Post." "What about the silverware? Any findings there?" "Nothing conclusive. No obvious poison residue." Pearlie frowned, though one of the texts mentioned something odd about one of the forks. A slight discoloration. Could be nothing, or it could be everything, I thought. Back at the brownstone, Saul Panzer was waiting with Wolfe. His normally impassive face showed a hint of satisfaction. "I found Robert Finch," he announced. "Real name is Robert Voss. He's Gregory Voss's nephew." "Well, well," Wolfe murmured. "Family connections." "Gets better," Saul continued. "He studied chemistry at MIT before dropping out 3 years ago, and he's been working odd jobs since, including as a lab assistant at a pharmaceutical research company that handles toxic metals." The final piece clicked into place. "Including thallium?" "Especially thallium," Saul confirmed. "They use it in experimental treatments." I reported my conversation with Pearlie, including the toxicology findings. Wolfe listened intently, his eyes half closed in concentration. "We now have method and opportunity," he said when I finished. Robert Voss, with his chemistry background, coated one of Lambert's forks with a thallium compound designed to dissolve slowly when exposed to acid. As the silversmith, he had access to Lambert's personal cutlery, and as Gregory Voss's nephew, he had motive to protect his uncle from exposure. "But we still need proof," I pointed out. "Without the contaminated fork or a confession, it's all circumstantial." "Indeed," Wolfe opened his eyes fully. "Which is why we will reconvene this evening with all parties present. Archie, arrange it, 7 o'clock, everyone who was at that table, plus Bernard Shaw, and Eliza Winters. And Inspector Kramer, of course. Kramer won't come without more than what we've got. Tell him we've identified Lambert's killer and can prove it. That should suffice." I spent the afternoon on the phone, arranging the evening's gathering. Most agreed readily, though Gregory Voss required some persuasion, and Bernard Shaw initially refused until I mentioned we'd be discussing the contents of Lambert's exposé. At 6:30, Fritz was arranging chairs in the office when the doorbell rang. It was Eliza Winters, arriving early and looking nervous. "I found something else," she said quietly, handing me a small flash drive. Julian backed up his research. This contains all his documentation for the exposé, including bank records showing Gregory Voss's offshore investments in Couteau d'Or. And there's correspondence between Voss and his nephew about taking care of the problem. "This is exactly what we needed," I told her. "Wait in the front room. The others will be arriving soon." I took the flash drive to Wolfe, who was at his desk reviewing notes. "Final piece of the puzzle," I said, explaining what Eliza had found. Wolfe nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. We are prepared for the denouement." The doorbell began ringing as our guests arrived. I showed them into the office, arranging them carefully according to Wolfe's instructions. Gregory Voss was the last to arrive, looking confident and slightly bored. "I hope this gathering serves some purpose," he said as he took his seat. "Some of us have deadlines to meet." "Oh, it serves a purpose, Mr. Voss," Wolfe replied. "It will bring a murderer to justice." I glanced around the room at the assembled faces. Marcel Boucher, composed but tense, Donald Pratt, sweating slightly, Vivian Dexter, immaculate and watchful, Peter Morgan, the apprentice, nervously clutching his notebook, Bernard Shaw, the attorney, studying everyone with calculating eyes, and Gregory Voss, whose bored expression had slipped just slightly at Wolfe's words. Inspector Kramer sat in the yellow chair nearest to my desk, chomping on an unlit cigar and watching Wolfe with undisguised skepticism. "You claim to have solved this case," Kramer said gruffly. "Let's hear it." Wolfe settled back in his chair, his massive form perfectly still except for the slight movement of his lips as he began to speak. Chapter 7. The Final Course. "Before we begin," Wolfe said, "I should establish the parameters of our gathering. We are here to determine who killed Julian Lambert and why. I have invited all of you because each of you possesses information vital to this case." I watched the faces around the room. Donald Pratt shifted uncomfortably in his chair, which protested under his weight. Vivian Dexter remained perfectly composed, her posture rigid. Peter Morgan kept glancing at Gregory Voss, who maintained his mask of bored indifference. Marcel Boucher stared straight ahead, his chef's hands perfectly still on his knees. Bernard Shaw observed everyone with the calculated neutrality of a career attorney. "Mr. Goodwin will distribute copies of certain documents," Wolfe continued. "These are excerpts from Mr. Lambert's forthcoming exposé on financial improprieties within the restaurant reviewing industry." I handed out the packets we had prepared, keeping a close eye on reactions. Gregory Voss's face flushed slightly as he scanned the first page. Vivian Dexter's eyebrows rose a fraction. Bernard Shaw's expression hardened. "As you can see," Wolfe said, "Mr. Lambert had uncovered substantial evidence of undisclosed financial interests. Several prominent critics, including Mr. Voss, have significant investments in restaurants they review. A clear conflict of interest and violation of journalistic ethics." "This is preposterous," Voss snapped, his boredom evaporating. "These offshore accounts could belong to anyone. You can't prove they're mine." "But we can," I interjected. "The full documentation includes banking records with your signature, Mr. Voss, and emails between you and the holding company." Inspector Kramer leaned forward. "If this is true, it's damning, but it doesn't prove murder." "Indeed not," Wolfe agreed. "Motive alone is insufficient. But Mr. Lambert's discovery provided a powerful reason for certain parties to want him silenced before publication." Fritz entered with a tray bearing wine glasses and a bottle of white Burgundy. Another tray held small plates with what looked like miniature versions of the fatal duck pâté. "With Mr. Boucher's permission," Wolfe explained, "Fritz has recreated the dish served at the private tasting. Each portion is identical, prepared according to the original recipe." Boucher nodded stiffly. "I provided the recipe myself." "I ain't eating anything," Kramer growled. "Nor should you," Wolfe replied. "This is demonstration, not dinner." Fritz placed a plate and wine glass before each person, then discreetly exited. Beside each plate, he had placed 2 silver forks polished to a high shine. "Mr. Lambert died after taking his second bite of duck pâté," Wolfe said. "Not his first. This timing is crucial. He requested a fresh fork for his second taste, as was his custom. That fork was the murder weapon." The room was silent. I could almost hear the collective pulse quicken. "The method was ingenious," Wolfe continued. "The fork, and only that specific fork, was treated with a thallium compound designed to dissolve when it contacted the mild acidity in the pâté. The poison was not in the food itself, which is why no one else was affected." "That's absurd," Voss scoffed. "How would anyone ensure Lambert got the poisoned fork, and how would they know he would take a second bite?" To your first question, because the fork was part of his personal set, which he always used. To your second, because, as Ms. Winters has confirmed, Mr. Lambert invariably took exactly 2 bites of each dish when reviewing, the first for initial impression, the second for detailed analysis. Wolfe gestured toward the silverware beside each plate. These forks are, of course, harmless, but they demonstrate the elegance of the method. The poison was not detectable by sight or taste. It required sophisticated knowledge of chemistry to create a compound that would adhere to silver, remain stable until exposed to acid, and then dissolve at the precise rate to deliver a lethal dose. And who has this sophisticated knowledge? Bernard Shaw asked, his voice sharp. A chemist would, Wolfe replied, or someone with specialized training in metallurgy and toxicology, someone like Robert Voss, who worked briefly at William Steele and Sons under the name Robert Finch, specifically to gain access to Mr. Lambert's personal silverware when it was sent for cleaning. Gregory Voss's face drained of color. I don't know anyone named Robert Voss. He's your nephew, I said flatly. Your sister's son, former chemistry student at MIT and lab assistant at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, where he worked with thallium compounds. This is outrageous, Voss sputtered. You can't possibly... We have the employment records from both William Steele and Sons and Meridian, I interrupted. And we have your correspondence with Robert discussing the Lambert problem and how to handle it discreetly. Eliza Winters, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Julian suspected a connection. That's why he was looking into the silversmith. He mentioned it to me the day before the tasting. Peter Morgan was scribbling frantically in his notebook. Vivian Dexter watched the proceedings with the detached interest of an editor assessing a submission. Donald Pratt looked like he might be ill. Mr. Voss, Wolfe said, your nephew treated 1 fork, and only 1 fork, in Mr. Lambert's personal set with a slow-dissolving thallium compound. You knew that Lambert would use his own silverware at the tasting. You knew he would request a fresh fork for his second bite, and you knew that the thallium would take effect only after that second bite, making the timing appear mysterious and confusing the investigation. You can't prove any of this, Voss said, but his voice lacked conviction. We have Robert's fingerprints on the silverware case, I said, and we have your financial transfers to him, $50,000 the day after Lambert died. Kramer had heard enough. He stood and addressed Voss. Gregory Voss, I'm placing you under arrest as an accessory to the murder of Julian Lambert. You have the right to remain silent. As Kramer recited the Miranda warning, I watched the other guests. Marcel Bocci looked stunned. Bernard Shaw was already reaching for his phone, no doubt calling a criminal defense attorney. Eliza Winters sat very still, her face unreadable. Where is Robert Voss now? Kramer demanded after finishing the warning. We believe he left the country, I replied. But Saul Panzer has located him in Montreal. Canadian authorities have been notified. Kramer gestured to Sergeant Stebbins, who had been waiting in the hallway. Take him downtown and get APBs out for this Robert Voss character. He turned to Wolfe. I'll need all your evidence. Mr. Goodwin will provide copies, Wolfe replied. The originals remain with us until the case is formally closed. As Voss was led away, protesting his innocence, the remaining guests sat in shocked silence. Donald Pratt was the first to speak. Does this mean the exposé won't be published? The contents are now evidence in a murder investigation, Wolfe replied. But eventually, yes, I expect the information will become public. Marcel Boucher stood. I should return to my restaurant. There will be changes needed in light of these revelations. One by one, they departed. Eliza Winters was the last to leave. At the door, she turned to me. Julian would have appreciated the irony. She said quietly, killed by his own fastidiousness about silverware. After everyone had gone, I returned to the office where Wolfe was savouring a beer, his eyes half closed in satisfaction. "A successful conclusion," he murmured, "though Kramer will take the credit, as usual. And our fee? Will be paid in full by Mr. Boucher, as agreed, plus expenses." I sat at my desk and looked at the documents scattered across it. The case had been solved through Wolfe's methodical reasoning and attention to detail, particularly his focus on the timing of Lambert's symptoms. The poisoned fork was an elegant solution to the puzzle of how one man could be poisoned while 6 others eating the same food remained unharmed. Tomorrow I would type up the full report for our files, but tonight, as the spring evening settled over the brownstone, I had a feeling our involvement with the restaurant world wasn't quite finished. Wolfe was eyeing the duck pâté Fritz had prepared with unmistakable interest. Chapter 8. The Second Slice. The morning after Gregory Voss's arrest, I was at my desk typing up the final report when the phone rang. It was Inspector Kramer. "They found Robert Voss," he said without preamble. "Canadian police picked him up at a hotel in Montreal. He's not contesting extradition." "Confessing?" "Singing like a canary. Says his uncle masterminded the whole thing, promised him $100,000 and a new identity." "Which confirms our reconstruction," I noted. Yeah. Kramer always hated admitting Wolfe was right. "The lab boys finally found traces of thallium on that second fork, by the way. Some new test they tried. Anyway, case closed." After hanging up, I reported the news to Wolfe, who was in the office reading a book on Byzantine history. "Satisfactory," he said, not looking up. "Though I imagine there are still loose ends to tie up." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. It was Eliza Winters and Peter Morgan, Lambert's assistant and apprentice. I showed them into the office where Wolfe marked his place in his book and regarded them with mild interest. "Mr. Wolfe," Eliza began, "we wanted to thank you personally for solving Julian's murder and to discuss the exposé." "Ah," Wolfe said. "I presumed that might be your concern." Peter Morgan opened his notebook. "Julian entrusted us with continuing his work if anything happened to him. With Gregory Voss arrested and Robert Voss in custody, we feel it's safe to move forward with publication." "A reasonable assessment," Wolfe agreed, "though there remains the question of the other critics and restaurateurs implicated in Mr. Lambert's investigation." "That's partly why we're here," Eliza said. "We have the complete files now, but we'd value your insight on how to proceed." Wolfe's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "I am a detective, not a publisher." "But you understand the implications," Peter insisted. "This story goes beyond Voss. There are at least 5 other prominent critics with hidden financial interests in restaurants they review. The industry will be upended." "As perhaps it should be," Wolfe replied. "Transparency serves the public interest." I watched the exchange with interest. Wolfe rarely concerned himself with the aftermath of his cases, preferring to consider his involvement concluded once the criminal was identified. "There's something else," Eliza said after a moment. "We've been approached by Marcel Boucher. He wants to make a statement acknowledging the improper relationship with Voss and announcing reforms at Couteau d'Or." "A prudent decision," Wolfe noted. "Self-preservation often motivates ethical epiphanies." The doorbell rang again. This time it was Saul Panzer, arriving for a scheduled meeting about the case's loose ends. I introduced him to our visitors. "I've completed the financial trace," Saul reported. "The money trail confirms everything. Gregory Voss owned 15% of Couteau d'Or through an offshore shell company. He gave favorable reviews to restaurants he invested in, boosting their value." "And Lambert discovered this pattern," I added. "Not just discovered," Peter said. "He had documented it meticulously for years. The exposé was to be his masterpiece, a complete investigation into corruption in food criticism. Wolfe folded his hands over his substantial middle. The motive becomes even clearer. Mr. Voss stood to lose not only his reputation, but his considerable investments if the article were published. "The method still amazes me," Eliza said, using Julian's own fastidiousness against him. "Many victims contribute unwittingly to their demise," Wolfe observed. Mr. Lambert's insistence on fresh silverware for his second taste provided the perfect opportunity. Peter looked up from his notebook. "The chemistry is fascinating. Robert Voss created a thallium compound that would only dissolve in the presence of acid, like the wine vinegar, and cognac in the pâté. The reaction required time," Wolfe explained. "The first bite was harmless because the poison had not yet dissolved into the food. By the second bite, the reaction had progressed sufficiently to deliver a lethal dose. The science of murder, elegant in its way, though I kept that thought to myself." Fritz appeared at the door. "Lunch is served, sir." Wolfe never discussed business during meals, so our visitors departed with promises to keep us informed about the exposé's publication. After they left, I joined Wolfe in the dining room where Fritz had prepared a spring vegetable soup, followed by poached salmon with dill sauce. "A satisfactory conclusion to the case," Wolfe said, between appreciative mouthfuls, "though I suspect the repercussions in the culinary world will continue for some time." The repercussions for our bank account were immediate and positive. That afternoon, a messenger delivered an envelope from Marcel Boucher containing a cheque for the agreed fee plus a substantial bonus. Enclosed was a note inviting Wolfe to a private dinner, a couteau d'or, once the restaurant reopened. A genuine token of gratitude for preserving my establishment's integrity. Wolfe read the note with a faint smile. "Integrity is a curious concept in the restaurant business, it seems. Will you accept?" "The cheque, certainly." "The dinner invitation requires consideration." Later that evening, after Wolfe had gone up to his orchids for the day, I sat in the office finishing my report on the case. The phone rang once more. It was Bernard Shaw, Lambert's attorney. "Mr. Goodwin, I'm calling to inform you that Julian's estate has approved publication of his exposé. It will appear as a special feature in Food and Wine Monthly next month, with proper attribution to his assistants for completing the work." "Justice in journalism," I remarked. "Indeed." "Additionally, the estate wishes to acknowledge Mr. Wolfe's contribution. A case of rare Bordeaux will be delivered tomorrow. Wolfe would appreciate that more than public recognition. Wine and justice, a satisfying combination." The next morning at breakfast, I found Wolfe reading the newspaper with unusual attention. A small article on page 3 announced Gregory Voss's arrest and Robert Voss's extradition proceedings. The piece mentioned renowned private detective Nero Wolfe as instrumental in solving the case. "You made the papers," I noted. Wolfe responded, turning to the crossword puzzle. A week later, Fritz outdid himself with a special dinner featuring duck pâté en croûte, prepared according to Bausch's recipe, but with Fritz's own refinements. Wolfe savoured each bite with closed eyes, making small sounds of appreciation. "Magnificent," he pronounced. "The pastry is perfect." "And safely consumed with a single fork," I added. Wolfe's eyes opened. "A poor jest, Archie." But I caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that passed for a smile. The case of the poisoned second slice had satisfied his bank account, his intellect, and now his palate. In the world of Nero Wolfe, that constituted a perfect resolution. As for me, I had gained a new appreciation for restaurant critics and a healthy suspicion of custom silverware. Some lessons from murder investigations are more practical than others. Thanks for joining us for The Second Slice Was Poisoned. Did you suspect Gregory Voss and his nephew before Nero Wolfe revealed the ingenious method with the poison fork? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember, Wolfe's wisdom: the most perfect crimes often fail because of the tiniest details, and a murderer's cleverness is frequently outmatched by their own vanity. This is Alfie signing off from Cafe Stories.